Hey everyone, how are we doing today? This is James Sweeney, aka SplitSuit, and today we're going to be doing a video called Common Mistakes Part 1. And this is going to be all about the kind of mistakes that I tend to see time in and time out between different players, and players at micro, even players at small tend to have these kinds of mistakes. They're very, very common, thus the name. So just to do a quick table of contents, you guys know what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start off talking a little bit about stats and sample sizes, and this is very related to the HUD video. So if you saw the HUD video, you already have a step up in this, but if you didn't, this will still be useful by itself, and it's still useful even if you did see the HUD video. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the rationale for making plays. This is a major area where I think a lot of people fall down, is they do things for the wrong reasons. And just because something turns out to be right, if you did it with the wrong rationale, in the long run you're going to get hurt. So we're going to want to talk about that and talk about how to improve there especially. Then we're going to talk a little bit about positional awareness. And positional awareness is just so crucial. I've said it in other videos that position is king, and I really, really mean that. So we're going to talk about position, how to think about it, how to use it to our advantage, and also how to stay away from bad positions. And then we're going to talk a little bit about mistake propensities. So we're going to talk about what they are, we're going to talk about who has what kind of mistake propensities, and most importantly, how to use this to our advantage. And then we're just going to recap the video from there. And we're going to be doing a mixture between classroom and going into the replayer for this vid, so there'll be a lot of jumping around, but just stay focused, stay with me, and we'll have some fun and get through this. So let's first start by talking about stats and sample sizes, and start from there. Alright, so let's first start by talking about stats. So I think there's two things that people tend to do, and rarely do people tend to get it right, in my opinion, right off the bat. The first one is that some people put way too few stats on their HUD. They put stats, maybe the Holy Trinity, or maybe they add a couple extra as well, but they just put so few stats on there that they're missing pieces of information that could be really, really useful. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have people that put way too many stats on their HUD. They have like every single turn stat, every single river stat, and they have all these stats on there that aren't incredibly useful or could need such a large sample size before they're even slightly useful. So what we want to do is find something in the middle. So if we just talk a little bit about the pros and cons of having too few or too little, the pros of having too few stats is that you can't make big decisions off of small amounts of info. That's always a good thing, because we don't want to be the kind of people that are looking at someone who has a 100% 3-bet stat, but really that's only because he 3-bet once out of one sample. That doesn't really tell us anything. He could have had a big hand, he could have been bluffing. We don't know. Its sample size is way too small. So it keeps us away from making that kind of mistake. And other pros for that is there's just not so much information glaring you in the face that you can make bad decisions. So, at least you have that going for you. The pros of having too many stats on your HUD, that any single time you need information, it should be there. So at least you have that going for you. But again, is that information really that useful? Is it relevant at all? So, the pros kind of are definitely outweighed by the cons. So the cons for having too many stats on your HUD is simply that there's too much information. A lot of it isn't going to be any sort of useful, and a lot of people forget to check the sample size. And so again, if you have a player who has 65 hands on him, how many times have you really seen him be able to river c-bet? Chances are not that many. So I actually suggest two things for this. One is don't put too many stats on your HUD. But two is that make sure that you are always checking sample size. Something that I actually did on my HUD a while ago was I made my sample size font about 3 times bigger than any other stat on my HUD. Because what it forced me to do is it forced me to always look at that sample size. I couldn't get lazy because it was right there, it was mega massive, and I was always catching myself looking at it because that's what you want to be doing. So again, those are some cons for having too many. Cons for having too few is that you could need information and not have it readily available. So, even something as simple as fold versus steal, which is something that I've suggested always throwing on your HUD, If you don't have that on your HUD and you're considering going for a slightly lighter steel and you don't have that kind of stat, which is a stat that can converge relatively quickly, then you might miss out on good steal spots, or worse, you could steal in a situation that's horrific. So again, it's kind of find a happy medium between the two. And again, watch the HUD video if you don't know what I'm talking about, or if you're struggling on finding a HUD that works really well for you, would be my major suggestion. And the other aspect of this, which I kind of already talked about, is sample sizes and making sure that you're working within good sample sizes and you understand what a good sample size is. So again, a sample size is strictly how many hands we have on someone. You can always talk about sample size as far as how many times a certain situation could have happened. So for instance, again, if we look at 3-bet and someone has a 50% 3-bet, but it's really 1 out of 2 samples, the sample size isn't really that useful. So his 50% looks massive, but really it's kind of a null and void thing because it's not important nor relevant or useful. So what I really suggest using or understanding is that certain stats are going to converge faster, aka be more useful. So something like VPIP and PFR, which happen every single hand, are going to be useful a lot faster than something like turn c-bet, which is going to happen a lot more rarely. So I would just suggest making sure that you only show stats that are relevant and happen often. And if you have a stat, say you really want to have turn c-bet on your HUD, that's cool. But either make sure that you can quickly find how many samples that stat happened over, or one of my favorite things to do, and I know you can do this in HEM, I'm not sure about Poker Tracker 3, is that you can set it so it will only show a stat on your HUD after it's happened X amount of times. So for instance, I don't have fold versus steal pop up on my HUD until it's happened at least 5 times. So it forces me to ensure that I'm looking at stats that are going to be at least a little bit more real than seeing 100% fold versus steal because it's 1 out of 1. So again, the stats you keep on your HUD, the sample sizes that you're thinking about are very useful, and this is a very common mistake I see people make, again, either bloating their HUD or underutilizing it, and also using incorrect stats because the sample size is nowhere near relevant. So with all that said, let's go jump into the replayer and talk a little bit about rationale for making plays, which is another area where a lot of people tend to fall down. So why don't we actually just start by looking at a hand that I find is very common occurrence amongst a lot of full ringers for one reason or another. So we raise, get one caller, totally standard. We go for an airball c-bet thinking it'll pick up. We fail. Pick up an ace, go for a bet, get check raised, call, face a bet on the riv, call that, and end up losing. So this is 100% standard, and standard in that it happens a lot. And this is also something a lot of people say, oh, I run so bad, I only improve when I'm behind, all this kind of stuff. But really, a lot of this problem, or a lot of this issue in the hand can actually be pinpointed down to exactly this situation. This exact spot is why most people tend to get killed. So the leak we were going to talk about here is rationale for making plays. And one of the big things we always want to be doing is understanding why we do anything. Because if we don't understand why we're doing what we're doing, we're not growing as players, and chances are we're going to be veering away from good logical decision making, which is something that we don't want to do. So, making of a play. So let's talk about the making of a bet, because that's the big thing that a lot of people tend to mess up. A lot of people tend to get checking right and that kind of stuff, but what makes for a good bet or raise is pretty important. So there are 2 big pieces behind a good bet or raise. The first is that the bet is going to get better hands to fold, or 2, that we're going to get worse hands to continue. That simple. There's also a third option, and it wouldn't be very thorough if I didn't talk about it, so I will mention it. And the third option is to effectively clean up equity, to deny our opponent the chance to actualize his chunk of equity, no matter how big or small it is. Now, the reason why I don't oftentimes talk about number 3 outright is because a lot of people misuse it, and also it's a situation that doesn't come up as much as people think it does. And you'll also notice when I'm talking about these reasons for why we bet, not once have I used the word protection. And when someone tells me that the reason why they made a bet was for protection, it pains me. It's honestly a very painful thing for me to hear, because that's not a real reason. Now, a lot of people, the famous one is, I'm betting for protection against a flush draw. No, you're not. You're betting for value against a flush draw because you're getting worse hands to continue, but it's not for protection. That's not what it's for. So, if at any given point we're going to bet, we better be able to figure out why we're doing it. If we can't, chances are we probably shouldn't be doing it. Literally that simple. So, in a situation like this where we're betting, or thinking about betting, the question I'm asking myself is, if I'm going to bet, are worse hands going to continue? Because when I'm betting with top pair, decent kicker, that's what I should be doing it for. I shouldn't be betting to get better hands to fold because, one, not a single better hand is ever going to fold here, and two, then we'd effectively be turning our hand into a bluff. So, like I said, the question I ask here is, can I get worse hands to continue? If my opponent's a really stupid fish who's going to continue here with things like 10-9, 8-9, 7-6, pocket jacks, then it makes the bet a lot better, because then I'm getting a lot of worse hands to continue. All of a sudden I'm doing a lot better in both my rationale and my profitability in the hand. If my opponent wouldn't continue with second best hands, or wouldn't continue anywhere near enough at the time, then it makes my bet not so useful. So if my opponent were a nit here, and I know that he's going to fold things like queens and jacks, and 10x if he has it, and pocket 9s and 8s, then my bet doesn't do anything. Then all I'm doing is effectively turning my hand into a bluff. So it would have been a great bet to make with, say, 8-6, but a really crappy bet to make with ace-jack. So, again, this is what we need to think about, is what are we betting for? What's the rationale? And making sure that all of our bets are profitable and are logical and make sense. If they don't make sense, then don't do them. Figure out a different line instead. And because oftentimes in this situation you're going to have two options, you can bet or you can check. If your bet isn't good, the only option left is just to check. So let's talk about some raising situations and talk about them as well. So one of the biggest difficult hands, in my opinion, at flowering is queens, because a lot of people don't fully know what the heck to do with a preflop, and to be fair, it is kind of a difficult situation. So let's take a situation where this happens, and a lot of people, for one reason or another, want to 3-bet this. And when we're 3-betting, it's the same rationale as if we're going to be betting, is my hand going to get better hands to fold? Which in this case, obviously, not a chance in hell. Or two, can I get worse hands to continue? And preflop's always a little bit different, because say you do get some extra worse hands to continue, if, say you get him to call here with something like 7s and 8s sometimes, which of course is profitable for us, it's a second best hand, it only has 18 and change % equity, that's good for us. But if he's never going to make a mistake with that post-flop, it might not be the most profitable endeavor for us to 3-bet just because he makes some slight mistakes pre-flop with it. So just something to consider. So I think a lot of people too eagerly 3-bet this and pick it up and don't even think twice about it. And when they get 4-bet, they freak out and either make too many mistakes against aces or kings, or fold too much, or whatever the heck it is. And again, because you won the pot, a lot of people, or because the person won the pot, they tend not to think about it again. But really, it's not a great 3-bet in my opinion, unless your opponent's going to make a lot of calling mistakes pre, and he's going to continue that mistake-making post-flop, because that's what's going to make it profitable for us. So a situation would be like this, where I flat it, and of course I'm sometimes going to have to deal with an ace or king on flop, in fact about a third of the time, and that happens. But do you really think that you can't make good decisions both the 2/3 of the time that it doesn't happen, and even the third of the time it does happen? I think you'll be able to pick that off enough of the time, either by peeling off the flop, or knowing when you're behind and getting away from it. And again, if the 3-bet doesn't really accomplish all that much, what the hell was the point of it? Again, there really wasn't. So in this situation, he bets, we call, totally standard, he checks. So at this point, there are some players that I will consider checking this against, if I don't think that they would make any calling mistakes. But your average person would probably bet here again with things like aces and kings. They're probably showdown value sometimes with things like 6s, 8s, 10s, and jacks. So I'm assuming I can probably get enough value to go for a bet. He calls. 6 on the riv, totally bricks everything except for pocket 6s, so I just assume I can go for another bet and go for something like half-ish pot, trying to get him to look me up. I don't really want to pot here if he's never going to call a $41 bet with his second best hand. Because if I do, again, if I'm betting for value and nothing worse continues, it's not actually a good bet. It's a crappy bet. So you can contort that by either not betting or by changing the size and making it more profitable for your opponent to continue. So again, it's a really easy way to win pots by flatting with queens pre-flop and full ring, especially when your opponent opens from early position or middle position and wouldn't make very many mistakes versus the 3-bet. So again, thinking about your rationale for betting or raising is very, very useful, especially when contemplating pre-flop lines, which ultimately can change your profitability post-flop as well. So let's talk about everyone's oh-so-favorite hand, Ace-King, and we'll take this very, very common situation. This is not a fun spot because it's very difficult to know what to do. Now at this point we have 3 options. We can call, we can fold, or we can 3-bet. And pretty much what I do in this situation is I look at all 3 of my options and say, okay, what do I think would happen if I did each? And obviously if I fold, I know it's gonna be neutral EV. And so if either one of the other 2, 3-bet or flat call, is profitable, I have to do one of those. If neither of them are profitable, then I can fold. Very, very simple. So again, if we break it back to rationale, if we 3-bet, what's it accomplishing? Well, ace, king, and queens, although people tend to think that they're roughly the same hand, are actually quite different in a preflop sense. When we're 3-betting with queens, we better be doing so for value. When we 3-bet with ace-king, it's rarely for value. And it's rarely for value because you almost never get your opponent to continue with second-best hands. Maybe your opponent occasionally continues with ace-queen or something dominated, but pairs have really good equity against you, and you don't really beat much if you get action. Especially the way ranges contort at full ring. It's just rarely going to be the case, especially when you're 3-betting EP or MP opens. So when you're 3-betting ace-king, it's not really for value. And I hate to say it's a bluff because ace-king is just such a strong hand, has a lot of equity. So when I'm 3-betting ace-king majority of the time, I'm thinking of it more in terms of a semi-bluff. It's one of those situations where I would like to get folds. I'm totally cool if I uncontestedly pick up 4.5 big blinds. And if my opponent happens to call me, I always have a lot of equity that I can actualize and play poker with, especially when I'm in position. So ace-king's one of those awkward ones where it can be more of like a semi-bluffy type hand, and it's not really a 3-bet for val, it's not really a 3-bet for bluff, it's kind of sitting right there in the middle. And a lot of people confuse the reason for 3-betting both queens and 3-betting ace-king, and that's why I want to talk about it, because these are tough hands, but they also happen a lot. They're also hands that we're almost always going to be giving action with, not always with ace-king, but with queens majority of the time. So it's important that we're understanding how to make money with them, the rationale behind the hand, and that we're able to turn these into very good profits. So another leak I was talking about earlier is positional awareness, or lack of positional awareness. And I've talked about it before, and I'll definitely talk about it again, is that position is king. Simple as that. When you're in position, you're able to see what happens in front of you, you're able to gather more information, you're able to ultimately play better poker, make better decisions, make more money. That simple. So position is king, and because of that, we always want to be focused on being positionally aware. And positionally aware means that you are effectively utilizing your late position and staying out of trouble when you know your chances of being out of position are increased. So the big issues that I tend to see in a lot of players is, one is opening ranges. And sometimes what I see is that people open way too flat. And what I mean by that is that they open roughly the same amount of hands from every single position. And I've talked about that before, and that's usually not a good thing to do, because what you're doing is you're not allowing yourself to utilize your post-flop advantage, your positional advantage, and you're putting generally too many hands into your early position range. And that kind of wraps into my next point, is that people tend to use pretty bad opening ranges from EP. And some people are too wide, some people are too tight, although rarely do I ever say someone's too tight. Because, say for instance, you're an okay player, you're not super comfortable post-flop, but you feel you have an okay grasp on it, are you really going to make money by opening king-queen from early position? You're going to have a tough time when you catch top pair post-flop, and you're always going to have some reverse implied odds. Couple that with the fact that you are going to miss the flop roughly 2/3 of the time. So you're putting yourself into a really awkward situation. And coupled on top of that is the majority of the time when you raise and get called, you're going to be out of position. So now you not only have to play a really awkward spot, but you have to do so out of position. And that's just a situation where you're probably not going to make a lot of money. So I'm not going to go over exactly what range you should raise, because it does change based upon what game you're playing, based upon your skill level, blah blah blah. But I want you to really be thinking about, are you going to be able to profitably raise that? Do you expect to have a good situation? And if you expect to raise and, create a situation that you're not going to flourish in, probably consider choosing another line, most likely going for folds. Okay? And the other thing that I want to talk about as far as positional awareness is stealing. And take, for instance, this situation where it folds around to us and we're on the button. So I'm on the button, for sure I'm going to have position, and this is just one of those nice, really profitable spots where if the people behind me aren't like incredible fish or aren't incredible 3-betters, but are pretty standard people with relatively high fold versus steals, this is a situation that I really want to abuse and just try to pick up the blinds uncontested, because this is a spot where I can make a lot of profit. It's a really nice situation. I only have 2 more people to get through before the blinds are mine. And of course, picking up a blind and a half, while it may not seem like a lot, definitely adds up and can definitely pad the heck out of my win rate, which I'm really, really comfortable with and really, really want to be doing. So this is something that I would always be looking for, are steals. And this is why being in late position, the cutoff, the button especially, is looking for steal opportunities and really being able to abuse them. And part of that is kind of knowing who's on your left. Can you steal, can you not? Which again kind of reverts back to our first leak that we were talking about as far as the stats and the sample sizes. So this is something that I would consider looking for whenever possible, is throwing in extra steals, utilizing your positional advantage, and overall just being a little bit more positionally aware in your own game. We can also use positional awareness when considering things like 3-betting and flatting, not just always open raising. So for instance, take this situation where the hijack opens, and we're in the cutoff with king 10 suited. So in this situation, again, we have our 3 options. We can call, we can fold, or we can 3-bet. So at this situation, I don't really think I can call super well. It's going to be kind of tough to play against him. There's a lot of reverse implied odds, and unless I have some good information on how he's going to play post-flop and if I'm going to be able to get heads up or not with him, chances are I'm just not going to be doing a lot of flatting here. So at this point, my only options are a 3-bet or fold. So kind of what I like to do is I really like to use position to attack individuals. And we can use it to attack people when stealing, but we can also use it to attack people when 3-betting. And the reason why I like doing this is because I'm in position, which of course means my opponent is going to be out of position, and it's going to apply a lot of extra pressure to him. Is he really going to want to call me out of position with whatever he has? Most of the time he's probably just going to hate life and probably end up pushing the fold button a lot of the time. And if he's doing that, that's just printing money for me. I can't even begin to complain about that. So these are situations I like to look for, situations where I can utilize my being in position and their being out of position. Now, if my opponent were a fish, there's not a chance in hell I'm going to do this, because he's just going to call me a lot, and then all of a sudden I'm in a very bloated pot with a very weak hand, and it's going to be really tough to make money. But if my opponent is intelligent, has a fold versus 3-bet, doesn't like to give a lot of action out of position, this is the kind of situation I want to be taking advantage of, so I can just print some extra profit with a hand that I probably normally would have just ended up folding anyway. Okay, and the last leak I wanted to talk about in this video is going to be mistake propensity, and understanding not only what that means, but how we can utilize it in our game and effectively make more profit. So when we're talking about mistake propensities, what we're talking about are how our opponents are going to make the most amount of mistakes and effectively what areas of their game we can use to capitalize on them and make more money versus them, both in a spot by spot basis and also just in a meta basis. So one of the things I like to do, and I do this kind of stuff off the table, is constantly think about what kind of mistake propensities each of my opponents have. So I normally consider having 6 different opponent types. Those would be nits, tags, lags, aggro-fish, passive fish, and unknowns. And what I do is I kind of think about all the mistakes they're going to make. And normally when a person is at the tighter side of the spectrum, I assume they're normally going to make more folding mistakes. And normally when they are at the more aggressive side of the spectrum, I assume they're going to make more betting mistakes. When they're on the passive side of the spectrum, I assume they're going to make more calling mistakes. And when they're unknowns, I don't really know, but I can just make educated guesses based upon how the level plays and how your average unknown at that level plays. For instance, if I'm playing 5 no limit, I'm probably going to assume all of my opponents are horrible and make massive amounts of calling mistakes. And if I'm playing something like 200, I'm probably going to assume that my average unknown is going to be better and probably is not going to make as many horrible calling mistakes or something like that. So again, it's all about making assumptions when you have minimal amount of info and figuring out how certain bits of info can be extrapolated upon to get bigger ideas based upon certain things. But anyway, so let's just run into a hand and talk about that real quick. So take a spot where we open kings, totally standard, get called by the butt, and we're just going to assume that the button is an aggro fish. The only information we have is like a 42-36 type guy. So this comes out, we go for a c-bet because we think he'll make way enough calling and or peeling and or floating mistakes. He calls, and turn comes a 2. So at this point, I think way too many people just look at their hand and say, oh my god, I has kings, oh my god, I has to bet, and then fire off here for 12. And am I saying that's bad? Not necessarily, but say we don't think our opponent would make a horrific amount of calling mistakes, but given his aggressive nature is probably going to bet the majority of the range he would call the flop with. Well, if that be the case, and I think I can induce that kind of mistake, why not? If he's going to be firing out a bet a massive amount of the time, and maybe the bet wasn't my bet wouldn't have been super great in the first place, why not do this? Now, if he's going to make mistakes, you might as well induce him, and obviously just kind of keep your thought process all the way down. If the river was an ace or a scary card and he fired off big and you didn't think he would bluff like that, okay, fine, you can fold, but if you thought he was an aggro fish and probably going to make a lot of bluffing/betting mistakes, I'm probably just going to continue on with my plan and just make the call down. And again, it's playing right into the kind of mistakes that our opponents are going to make. If my opponent's going to make a lot of betting or bluffing mistakes, why not give him the chance to do so? If I can make more money that way, it's almost irresponsible of me just to bet the turn because, oh my god, it has kings, and really think about, okay, what's my hands? How is my opponent likely to make mistakes? What's the board texture look like? And ultimately, how can I capitalize upon all of this and make the most amount of money in this hand? We can also use this thought process on the other side of the spectrum. So say we take a spot like this where we steal from the cutoff, get called by the small blind who's going to be a really nitty type dude. He checks, we go for a bet thinking that he'll occasionally fold, and the times that he doesn't fold, maybe we'll be able to pick it off on the turn or pick up some equity or anything like that. He calls. Turn comes a king and he checks. So at this point, our assumption was that he is a tight dude, so probably way more likely to give too much respect and probably push the fold button a little bit more. And the king is just the perfect card. It's an overcard, it's scary, it's unlikely that he caught it, and most importantly, given the mistake propensity that he makes, which is folding a lot, is we can probably go for a double barrel here and try to pick this up. Yes, all we have is 9 high, but because we have no hand, and because we have a situation where we assume our opponent is probably more likely to push the fold button, this can be a really nice spot for us to take advantage and pick up a pot with a nothing hand. And if the small blind were a fish, there's not a chance in hell I'm going to bet that, because a fish is going to continue with pocket threes for all I know. And he will have caught that king sometimes, and there's all this bad stuff that can happen. Whereas against someone who's predictable and too tight, they offer us the kind of situation where we can bluff a little bit extra and pick up these kind of situations that we might otherwise leave on the table against players that we either don't have enough info against, or players that we just know have the mistake propensity of giving too much action. And let's just look at one final hand. We open aces from EP, get called by the butt, and we go heads up to the flop. And we're just going to assume the button is kind of a calling station type fish. We've seen him make a lot of calling errors, and that seems to be his major mistake propensity. So we catch an overpair, and we go for a bet. He calls, go for deuce on the turn. And again, if we assume that he is a person who has a massive calling station propensity, it'd be kind of criminal for us not to bet here. Now, if this guy were an aggro-tard, we could possibly go for a check and try to induce some bluffing and betting mistakes for him. But if he's the kind of guy who's going to make a lot of calling errors, and we have a hand that's super strong and he can call with a bunch of second-best hands, we should really consider going for that bet purely for value. So he calls. And on the river comes a 9, it's the same exact thing. We have someone who we think is going to make a lot of calling mistakes. We think our hand is still best a lot of the time. Yeah, it's going to suck if we face a raise, but nothing at this point indicates that he's going to do that. And there's also a ton of stuff in his range he can still call. Queen X, 7X, maybe he calls with jacks or 10s sometimes, and there's a whole bunch of things like Queen Jack and Queen 10 and King Queen and Ace Queen and all these fun stuff that I think it'd be a little criminal not to go for a bet here and really try to make sure that we maximize value against someone who has such a propensity to make these kinds of mistakes. So again, thinking about mistake propensity, choosing lines based upon that mistake propensity. And you'll also notice again, mistake propensity is tied in a little bit to rationale for why we make plays, and also tied into the stats and sample size. If we have a guy who's running 50-25 over 4 hands, we don't know. We don't know if he's an aggro fish or a passive fish. He could just be a nit who had a card heater over 4 hands. We really have no clue. So again, we really want to make sure that if we're going to use stats to try to assume mistake propensity, that we understand that those stats are real. Because if they're not real, then there's going to be a lot more margin of error in the mistake propensity and or the reads that we're building. So that's going to wrap it up for this video. Again, big 4 mistakes that we talked about were stats and sample sizes, rationales for making plays, talked about positional awareness, and we also talked about mistake propensity. So if you have any questions, I definitely suggest going back through the vid. There's a lot in here, and or just ask questions below. I'd be happy to answer whenever I get the time. And I definitely do suggest asking questions if you have them. I'd be happy to try to help out. But I do think if you consider what we're talking about, why it's useful, and think about how to implement it into your own game, I think you're going to be much better off. So again, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, good luck out there and happy grinding.